Life here in Italy can really be all of those things and so much more. There are hundreds of beautiful quotes about Italy that you can find on the internet. And whilst there is so much truth to many of them, there is also another side to life in Italy. And in this video, I'm exploring the things that I wish people knew about living in Italy. I've been living here for nearly 8 years, but I know that I'm not alone in a lot of these experiences. In fact, I did a post on Instagram last week, which has gone semi-viral, and the comments on that post to do with loneliness here in Italy have been really, really fascinating to read and to hear people's different experiences, because Italy does have this other face. And if you plan to move here, this is the kind of conversation that you need to be paying attention to. Now, today's video is based on my own experiences, but also on some feedback that I received through an Instagram story from other people who are living here. So you can be rest assured that I'm not the only one that necessarily feels this way. Now, I need to caveat this, of course. Learning Italian is fundamental, and I'm in no way suggesting that you should move here and be like how I was and barely able to say a word. That was naive of me, and I still talk about it to this day as being one of my biggest regrets. But what I will say to you is that knowing the language isn't the solution for every problem here in Italy. It's going to make your life easier in terms of navigating everyday experiences, understanding bureaucracy, and being able to communicate with people and hopefully start to build those connections in time. But it's not the magic unlock that makes everything possible in this country. I think sometimes we forget that even in our own countries where we can speak the language and where people around us speak the same language too, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are friends with everyone that you come into contact with. And it's the same here in Italy. Just because you can speak Italian, it doesn't mean that your life is going to be somewhat easier in every single aspect of it. Like, yes, you're going to be able to have conversations with people, but it doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to be sitting at their dinner table for Sunday lunch next week. And that's the thing that I think so many people forget. I see a lot of comments on social media of people saying that, it's because you don't speak the language that you find life here difficult. But the language is only a part of the story. It's not the be all and end all. And as much as you need to know it, even Italian people struggle with life here at times. So I think that tells you everything that you need to know. I really dislike it when people come here to Italy and the first thing that they say is that life here is so cheap. Now, I did this back in 2018 when I moved here. A lot of my early content when I started this channel in 2021 was comparing kind of the life here in Italy to how it was back in the UK. And of course, I did talk about price as part of that. But the longer I spend living here, the more I realize just how relative that is. Because if you come here to Italy and you have a lot of money, then yes, life here feels very, very cheap, particularly in the south of Italy. But if you work here in Italy on an average Italian salary, which can be sometimes as low as 1,200 euros a month, and you are having to pay rent or a mortgage, your everyday expenses, with the way that prices of everyday goods are constantly increasing in this period, you start to see that life here is normal and maybe even at times pretty expensive. Even if I think back to London, like living in London is expensive. And yes, people always say, especially here in Italy, oh, but you earn so much more money in the UK. It's true, but then we pay so much more as well for everything else. And so in a way, it either balances itself out or kind of creates an imbalance in a negative sense. And so that's what we need to remember. When you are moving to Italy, at the beginning, the price is probably going to capture you, depending on your background and on your personal circumstances. But over time, you start to realize that the cost of living here is relative to everything else that is going on at that time. And so it's just something really, really important to consider. This ties into the whole expat versus immigrant debate, because in my early content, I did refer to myself as an expat, and a lot of the content that I produced had that kind of terminology weaved into it. But I've kind of leaned more in recent months into just being me, a person living here, a foreigner, an immigrant, because that's essentially what I am. When I started my content in 2021, I leaned into the terms that were being used around me. All of the groups that I had made connections through had been expat groups. when I was searching on the internet or on YouTube for videos about people living in Italy or in other countries, all I could see being used was the term expat. And so naturally, I leaned into that terminology because I wanted my content to reach the people that were interested in living in Italy. Over time, though, I've come to realise that expat, although the dictionary definition doesn't state this, is really more if you are planning to live in Italy on a short-term basis. When you plan to live in Italy on a longer-term basis, you are absolutely an immigrant. In fact, you're always an immigrant. Bottom line, whenever you have to deal with any bureaucracy here in Italy, you don't go to the expats office, you go to the immigration office. And I feel like sometimes we have to remember that because expat is a word that is loaded with privilege, wealth, choice, and immigrant tends to be the reverse of that. And I understand how the media uses this, and I understand probably why people prefer to lean into this term. But I would say to you as well, don't box yourself off. I hate being boxed off and into a particular category. And as a society, we're very good at labeling people as this or that. But just in the way that life is not linear, so too are people's experiences, backgrounds, and, journeys. And so putting yourself into a box and saying, I'm this and not that, or whatever it may be, almost feels somewhat limiting. You can use these terms in the way that suits you and works for you in your life. But of course, fundamentally, you know that you are an immigrant when you're living here because of all the processes and hoops that you have to jump through to stay as a legal resident in this country. So that truth never disappears. But I'm just not one to always get hung up on these labels. People get so heated about it. They want to tell me you're an immigrant, not an expat. I've never said that I'm not an immigrant. And so I feel like we have to just relax a little bit with these terms because it generates a lot of hatred sometimes in the most extreme circumstances, but also it just takes away the very human element of what people are doing. They're moving to another country to better their lives in some way, and that is fundamentally the most important thing to remember. I've always said it on this channel and through my content that no two people's experiences in Italy will ever be the same. And fundamentally, I repeat it here today because on that post on Instagram that I did talking about loneliness, there were a lot of people saying, I disagree. Italy is really friendly. I've made friends. I spend 4 to 5 months of the year here. And I had to respectfully comment on that and say, I'm very happy that that has been your experience because genuinely and truthfully, I am. If you've been able to come here and immediately make friends and build a social life in that way, I take my hat off to you because I haven't had that experience and I know many others here haven't. So if you've done it, it's an amazing thing. But it doesn't mean that other people's experiences are invalid. And that's the thing you've got to remember. Sometimes when you don't live in Italy 365 days of the year, you are going to have very different experiences to somebody who does. If I were just coming to Italy for 3 months at a time, I don't think I would pay attention to this aspect, or I probably wouldn't even notice that this really existed here. I would just be so busy throwing myself into the experience and it would just feel like an extended holiday. But when you're living here 365 days of the year, you go through the different seasons, you go through the different celebrations here, you spend many, many Sundays here on your own, you do start to notice a different side to life here. And you kind of realize that, these kinds of feelings are very, very valid. And so I guess tied into this also is the fact that we live in a society which is hyper-personalized. The algorithms on social media, on the internet, they're constantly feeding us content that is directly tailored to what we're looking for. So it's almost like when you hear somebody talking about something that is very different to your own experience, you immediately want to disregard it or say that it's wrong. But it's not that it's wrong. It's that person's experience. And that's something that we must always, always hold on to. No two people's experiences here are ever going to be the same, but it doesn't mean that you have to invalidate another person's experience because it hasn't been your own. We need to hold the space open for everybody to have their own experiences and journeys here in Italy. And that's just something that I want you to remember. I think that if I had started my YouTube channel in 2018 when I first moved here, I think that I would have really, really struggled with those kinds of comments telling me that, it's not possible that you can feel lonely here in Italy. Because at that point, I was struggling with loneliness when I first moved here. Like over time, though, I've come to make my connections and become stronger here. But it would have really impacted me at the beginning had I been creating content at that time to read comments like that. Because what you have to remember is that you've got to hold the space for people to feel what they're feeling. And just because it hasn't been your experience doesn't mean that it's not real. And I feel like we must remember that, because these are really, really important conversations that we need to be having. And trying to shame others into silence because you've not experienced it really doesn't help. And I think that's why I hold the space for people to talk about these things, because it's really, really vital that we do. Everyday life here in Italy is beautiful, but it can also be really, really frustrating. And I think the one thing that I hold on to is that even in those frustrating moments, there is a sense of beauty that can be found. The beauty is indeed in the reality. When you come here on holiday, you see mostly just the beautiful aspects of Italy. But when you're living here, you are presented with a more holistic 360-degree experience. And sometimes on the surface, that doesn't look, visually pleasing. But deep down, there are lots of lessons that you can glean from that experience. I realized that actually it's the humble, simple moments in life here that I actually find the most beautiful now, and they are the things that I hold on to. I find that the challenges and the difficulties that I have in this country, often there's a really important lesson that I can learn from those, something that I can take away from it to improve myself and my approach to life here. It is those moments that are beautiful, not just the aesthetically beautiful picture moments that we see on Instagram or social media, but those everyday raw moments of vulnerability that Italy displays. That is where the real beauty of this country can be found. There's a really romantic notion of living in a small town, which I don't think enough people really, really scrape beneath the surface of and explore, because small town living isn't all it's cracked up to be. It's not for everyone. When you see those pictures of living in the countryside with the rolling hills and the beautiful homes, and it just looks really peaceful and magical, what you're forgetting is that life there can be very, very different to living somewhere where there's a bit of hustle, bustle, and activity going on. Often in the countryside and small town locations, you find it very difficult to find people who may have done something similar to you and moved to Italy, or who might speak a little bit of English. It's usually non-existent in those places. Not to mention the fact that connections are not always that good. And so you really do need to drive if you want to live somewhere like that and not feel completely isolated. Activities and leisure activities, depending on where you are, can be more limited than if you're living in a bigger city. So you've just got to factor this in. It's really romantic to think that you could live somewhere like that in Italy, but the more practical sides of life need to be considered. Because if you don't want to drive here, for example, then you may find that you just end up being stuck in that area and not able to move around as freely as you might like to. Work in Italy isn't an easy thing to find necessarily, depending on where in the country you live and depending on the type of work that you want to do. I would say, on a whole, teaching English in Italy seems to be the easiest route to go down, only because it is something that is in demand in this country. But if you want to do something more specialist or more in alignment with your current role, it's not always as easy. And that's where you have to be really, really strategic about where you base yourself so that you can find the places where you can do that type of career. I feel like people often gloss over this fact, but I would say that not every part of Italy serves every type of career. This is the reason we are back here in the Salerno province, for example. And I feel like you have to remember that. Like, even Italians themselves struggle to find work here. And so you coming in as an outsider is not necessarily going to be easy for you. So you have to really be strategic about the type of work you want to do and exactly where you want to position yourself. I feel like it's easy to think that you can come here and immediately get work because of your skills, or because even if you speak the language Italian, it's not a given that you're necessarily going to find a job that easily. Holiday life versus everyday life. There is a stark difference between those two realities. And I think sometimes we have to really remember that, because it can be difficult to navigate your everyday life here. Transport infrastructure isn't necessarily very good, depending on where you are. You have to deal with like bureaucracy matters or navigating work situations, trying to make appointments with offices if you've got to get things done. It's not easy necessarily to navigate your everyday life here. And I think sometimes you have to have bucket loads of acceptance for this. You're going to have delays if you're waiting to have work done, for example. Maybe you're having some work done or you're waiting for something to be finished and the deadline keeps extending. Like, this is reality. This is the way things are here in Italy. Not everything runs smoothly. And so navigating these challenges is going to be a part of your everyday life. There's a beautiful quote from Tom Ford, which I think really sums this up, because essentially you just have to accept things for the way that they are here. I think where people struggle is that they come here and they expect things to be as they are, or they expect life here to adapt to them. And it just doesn't work that way. You are the person that's going to be adapting to life here. But I promise you, the challenges that you experience in your everyday life are shaping you and they're helping you to become a much better person. I think the people who struggle here the most are the ones that have friction against the way things are done here. You have to be willing to adapt. I remember in the early days of starting this YouTube channel, people would say to me, you don't need to change to live in Italy. And I would just read those comments and be like, that's really sad that you think that, because actually I've changed so much since I arrived and I continue to change every single day. And actually that's the beauty of living here. And that's how you know that you are allowing a country to shape you and help you to become a better person. If you move here and you're so rigid and inflexible that you don't think you ever need to change, I think that's when you run into friction here and when you find life here really, really difficult and maybe not even the country that you want to live in anymore. So I think there is a huge part of life here that requires you to accept things for the way that they are, even if they're radically different to what you're used to, which is kind of my experience 90% of the time. You've just got to go with the flow a lot more. And I really think that is the magic of life here. Adapting to life here is vital. And if you're not able to do it, then I really don't think that Italy is going to be the country for you. Your experiences in Italy could be wildly different to mine. And I've never said that anybody's experience is invalid on this channel, because I recognize how that is so true. What I will say, though, is that Italy has shaped me and helped me to become a much better person. And I talk about this in a lot more detail over on my Substack channel that I have recently launched. Real Italy is the name, where I do like weekly personal letters about different aspects of life here and deep diving into it. And this video has actually been inspired from last week's Substack that I created. So I'll put a link up here and also below in the show notes if you want to go and check it out. And if you're watching this video and you're thinking, do you know what, I wish I could have these kinds of conversations about real Italy, then I'm also going to suggest that you check out my community, the Aperitivo Lounge. That post that I did on Instagram about loneliness came from a conversation that we had within our very own community. And we've got people at all different stages of the journey there. And it's just a really beautiful place to have these kinds of conversations. I hope that this video has helped. And if you've enjoyed this video, this is the one that I recommend you watch next. I'll see you in the next video.